Okay, we're going to be talking about the ethics of creating people. So this is obviously a part of procreative ethics. So procreative ethics is, well, the many questions come up in procreative ethics. It's a pretty big area. Many of the people in the Uehiro Center work on this. I myself am not an expert by any means. This is something kind of new to me, something that has come up a little bit in my previous work, but I'd like to get into more in the future. So I'm not really an expert on this, just an amateur enthusiast. So please take things I say with a grain of salt. If it sounds wrong, please ask me about it because it just might well be wrong. Okay, so some of the questions that come up in procreative ethics are some, well, basic questions like, should we create people? Is it okay to create new people or new animals? If we're talking more than procreation. It also includes questions about what rights people have to procreate. For example, is it a political right? Should the state help people to procreate if they're not able to do so naturally? Things like that. Is it okay to use certain kinds of technologies like surrogacy or screening for certain diseases? Even should we be enhancing or selecting for certain characteristics in our future children? So we're going to look at what I think is the most basic or most fundamental question in procreative ethics, which is, do we have a moral reason to have or to refrain from having children? So at least the common intuition, that what I take to be the common intuition that most people have, is that having children is something sort of morally neutral, or at least it's up to you. You get to decide whether you have children or not. It's more like a personal decision rather than something that has strong ethical dimensions to it. So this is a little strange when you think about it, because most of our behavior impacts on other people. You know, we eat meat that harms the animal in the factory farm. We fly across the Atlantic that releases carbon that then, increases climate change and things like that. So we do all kinds of actions in our daily lives that have effects on other people and animals. And we're rightly sort of bound by moral norms or certain things we can and can't do. Yet, in the case of producing children, we seem to just have a laissez faire attitude. It's just do what you want to do. Have kids if you want them. Don't have them if you don't want them. And there doesn't seem to be much of a moral prerogative to do so or not to do so, which is a bit strange because having children, of course, is a major way in which we affect other people around us. So even forgetting about the child we're thinking of creating for a moment, when we create a child, we're creating a new consumer who's going to release a lifetime's worth of carbon impacting on the environment. We, in 99% of cases, are going to create another being who eats animals every day of their life for 70, 80, 90 years. We create someone who might harm other people in the future, for example. There's also risks that the child we are creating will end up having a bad life. You know, even if we take all possible precautions and we screen for various diseases and we have all the medical checkups we need, something could happen such that the child we create ends up having a really wretched life, unfortunately. These tragic things do happen. So it seems as if by having children, we are having huge effects on other people and the child themselves who we actually create. So it seems that if these other behaviors we do are open to moral criticism, it should be the case for having children too. Okay, so one view in procreative ethics, which is becoming more popular recently, is antinatalism. So antinatalism is the position that it's generally wrong to procreate. There's many different arguments for antinatalism. We're just going to look at one and hopefully two if we have the time to do so, both by David Benatar. So the first one we're going to look at is the misanthropic argument, essentially the argument that people are so bad we shouldn't keep making them, and the philanthropic argument, which says coming into existence is such a harm that we should not inflict that on anybody. Okay, so the misanthropic argument is probably best summed up in a quote from Benatar: humanity is a moral disaster. There would have been much less destruction had we never evolved. The fewer humans there are in the future, the less destruction there will be. Or we can sum it up even more succinctly with a Calvin and Hobbes comic: people are rotten. So Benatar's basic argument is people are so harmful. They do so much harm to each other, to their fellow humans, to animals, and to the environment that there is a sort of presumption against procreation. In general, it's wrong for us to procreate unless there are very strong reasons why we ought to do in particular situations. Okay, so let's take a look at the argument first. Okay, so premise one, we have a presumptive duty to desist from bringing into existence new members of species that cause and will likely to continue to cause vast amounts of pain, suffering, and death. Premise two, humans cause vast amounts of pain, suffering, and death. Conclusion, therefore, we have a presumptive duty to desist from bringing new humans into existence. Okay, so this is a valid argument, meaning if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So I think it's kind of important we look at the premises and see if they are true or not. Let's start, as Benatar does, by looking at the reasons to believe premise two. So premise two is the premise that humans cause vast amounts of pain, suffering, and death. So Benatar begins his discussion here by describing what he calls the dark side of human nature. So he gives a long list of the various ways in which human beings are far less rational than we think we are. So he has a long list of all the cognitive biases or failures in reasoning, logical errors that human beings fall into every day. So these are things like status quo bias, sunk cost bias, confirmation bias, all the very familiar biases that human beings are unfortunately prone to. And these are much more widespread than we might think. As someone who teaches critical thinking, I can tell that they are very, very widespread indeed. Okay, but not only do we have these rational failings, we have very common moral failings that seem to be a deep part of our nature. Two in particular that Benatar is concerned with are our tendency to conform. So we just seem to do what other people do, even when that's something very bad or something very irrational, and our capacity to, or our willingness to obey commands from seeming authority figures, even if those commands are to do dreadful things. So for example, he brings up the Stanford prison experiment and the Milgram experiment. So if you're not familiar with these, the Milgram experiment is one in which not even a doctor or anything, just a person wearing a white coat invites you to press a button which will give an electric shock to another human being in the next room. So you can press the button and you see the person squirm a little bit, and the man in the white coat keeps asking you to turn up the power more and more. The person in the other room, unknown to you, is an actor, if you didn't know that. So he's not actually being electrocuted. And it seems to be the case that most people will just keep on pressing the button. They'll keep on turning up the power, even sometimes up to the point in which the actor dies. Okay, so these are kinds of examples of relatively common failures in both rationality and morality that characterize human beings. So Benatar characterizes humans not as Homo sapiens, but as Homo perniciosus, that is the dangerous, destructive human. And he goes on to describe three broad categories of harm that human beings are guilty of. So harm to other humans, harm to animals, and harm to the environment. We're just going to have a quick look at these. So if we've been paying attention to human history, we don't really need Benatar to tell us that human beings have done and continue to do pretty bad things. So he gives us a very long list of the various atrocities that human beings have committed against each other, back from prehistoric times, bonking each other on the head with clubs and sacrificing people and so on, up to genocide, slavery, unjust wars, etc., etc. So I think it's pretty clear that there is a vast body of evidence showing that human beings are capable of doing pretty vicious things to each other and seemingly to do so on a pretty regular basis. So a couple of things to note about this is that most of Benatar's examples are historical. They do come up to the present day, but he also sees the historical examples as sort of evidence of the psychological dispositions and drives that make human beings act. So he sees these historical examples as evidence of the kind of things we are capable of if the wrong circumstances arise. So as a kind of prediction for what our future behavior might be. He also wants to head off the objection that these atrocities are just committed by a minority. Sometimes that is the case, sometimes it really isn't. Sometimes these atrocities are just widely accepted by almost everyone in society. So slavery is a pretty good example of that. Even if everyone did not own slaves, everyone who was in the slave-owning class was sort of willing to accept this as an institution and saw it as the right way of running a society. Furthermore, people tend not to do anything to prevent such atrocities from happening. We tend to just keep our heads down and not resist when terrible things are happening around us. So these are just some of the examples of harmful actions that humans commit against each other. So If this was all of Benatar's argument, if his argument was just human beings really harm human beings quite a lot, well, maybe we could resist the argument easily enough. So even though it is true that human beings do all these terrible things to each other, of course, they do lots of nice things for each other, right? We help each other out all the time. We make life better for each other in innumerable ways. And even though all these atrocities have been happening throughout history, it still seems plausible enough that most people tend to have lives that are at least worth living, that contain more good things than bad things. So if his argument was just about the harms humans commit against each other, maybe we could resist it relatively easily. But when we move to include animals in the equation, I think things are a little bit different. So first off, the scale is vastly different. So while human beings only number about 8 billion at the moment, every single year we kill about 70 billion land animals and 1 to 2 trillion aquatic animals. That's just for food. These animals are kept in pretty awful conditions. If you know anything about factory farming, you know how dreadful that is. If you know anything about commercial fishing, it's also pretty brutal. It can take an hour or two for an animal to die once it's dragged up from the water. Everyone knows about sort of factory farm chickens and how brutal their lives are, living in cramped conditions, having various surgeries without anesthetic, and so on. But it's not only animal agriculture, we also use animals in scientific research, in product testing, even for pretty trivial products, in sports, and so on. And it seems to be the case here that, first off, the scale is massively higher. I mean, we're talking about trillions of animals every year, so it just dwarfs the amount of harm that we do to each other, that we have done to each other throughout all of history. The amount of harm we do to animals is just vastly higher. Second thing to note is that many of these animals just live bad lives, lives that are bad overall. So even with all the atrocities that humans commit against each other, it still seems that most people live at least worth living lives. This does not seem to be the case for animals such as factory farm chickens. It seems that they live lives that are worse than nothing for them. So I think his argument gets a lot stronger when we remember to include animals in the list of harms that humans commit. Okay, and his final category of harm is harms to the environment. Liz, would you just give me a warning if I'm getting close to, thank you, because I'm not keeping an eye on the time too well. Okay, so the last category is humans harming the environment. So for Benatar, the badness of environmental harm is that it's a sort of indirect way of harming humans and animals. So he's not too concerned about the environment itself per se. He's interested in the negative effects that are, say, mediated by our harm to the environment. So if we pollute the air and pollute the water, we reduce the health and lifespan of humans and other animals. If we cut down the forest, we get rid of habitats for animals. Climate change rises sea levels and threatens human habitations and animal populations, etc. But we might also make his argument a bit stronger here if we think, plausibly, I believe, that there's something intrinsically valuable about the planet that we have, the biodiversity that it contains, etc. So if we think that our environment or our planet and the biodiversity on that planet is intrinsically valuable, not just valuable for what it gives us, then it seems even worse that human beings are committing all these harms against the environment. It seems like we're doing extra bad things rather than just indirectly harming humans and animals. Okay, so I think all of that constitutes a pretty strong defense of the second premise. Remember, the second premise doesn't say humans don't do any good things, or he doesn't even say that the good that human beings do cannot outweigh the bad things. It just says we harm and we cause a lot of harm and destruction, a huge amount of harm and destruction. So I think he has pretty strongly defended that premise. Let's have a look at the other one. So premise one is that we have a duty to desist from bringing into existence new members of species that cause and likely will continue to cause vast amounts of pain, suffering, and death. So just to unpack this a little bit, this is not the strong claim that we should kill or cull members of harmful species. It doesn't even say we should prevent people from procreating. It's just a very modest claim that each of us individually has a duty not to procreate. And what he means by presumptive duty is that this is a duty that can be defeated in exceptional circumstances, but usually is not. So he gives an example of driving through red lights on the road. So we have a presumptive standing duty to not drive through red lights. We have a duty to stop at red lights. This is not because every single time you drive through a red light, someone is going to get hurt or killed. It's just the the chances are that if you go through red lights often enough, you're going to kill somebody, right? So we have a presumptive duty. There might be some cases like rushing to the hospital to save someone's life in which you should rush through the red lights. But his argument is simply most of the time, for most of us, we'll have strong reasons not to procreate. Okay, so how can he defend this premise? So he doesn't do a very thorough job, in my view, of defending it. He gives a couple of reasons why we might want to believe the normative premise. The first is that it's very widely accepted when the species in question is not our own species. So if we're thinking about animal species or bacteria or viruses or something, we are all behind this premise. No one is happy to, no one is going to celebrate you if you open up a laboratory that's creating vast amounts of smallpox bacteria, or if you create a new kind of mosquito that gives everyone a terrible disease. No one is going to shake your hand and give you the Nobel Prize for this, right? So when the species in question is not human, we pretty much accept this premise immediately. We think if the species in question causes a huge amount of harm, this gives us a very strong reason not to create more of them. Even more strongly, I think, in the case of non-humans, we will actually go further and say, not only should we not create more of these creatures, I think very often we think it's okay to cull species or destroy organisms that are harmful to us, and to actively prevent people from creating more of them. Okay. So secondly, it seems plausible that we have a general duty to prevent harm. So typically in our day-to-day lives, we ought to be preventing harms to other people and to other animals. In the case of human beings, if we cannot prevent humans from being harmful, maybe the second best thing we can do is to stop there being more humans. So I cannot stop John Smith from going out and harming other people. That's just not something I really have the power to do. But I definitely do have the power to make it the case that there are fewer John Smiths in the future. I just don't have children, and therefore this harmful being will not exist, will not harm anyone. And finally, it's important to note here that Benatar thinks that we cannot expect human beings will ever become significantly less harmful or less destructive than we already are. So this is why he spends so much time going through the sort of psychological dispositions that tend to result in us being harmful, and why he goes through so many historical and prehistorical examples. It's because he thinks the odds of us actually getting significantly better are just slim to none. I hope it'll get more cheerful soon. Okay, so I'm a little bit troubled by Benatar's argument. I think ultimately I don't buy it, but I think it's stronger than it's often given credit for. I'm going to try and present some considerations against his normative premise here. I'm not going to say anything against his second premise that human beings do, in fact, cause huge amounts of harm and destruction. I think that's just straightforwardly true. Maybe you will disagree with that and we can have a talk about that, but that's not something I'm going to criticize. What I will try and say something about is his normative premise that we have a presumptive duty not to cause members of harmful species to come into existence, specifically in the human case. Okay, so the first possibility is that human beings, despite what Benatar believes, it's quite possible that human beings could improve. So there is some evidence that human beings have improved, at least in terms of the amount of violence that we inflict on each other. So Steven Pinker's 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, it's a whole bunch of statistics and charts, which I just about understand, which seem to show that the rates of violence from prehistoric times through classical period to medieval to current day, right up to the present century, it's just a steady downward decline. The rate of violence per person is just lower and lower and lower each century, and it's vastly lower now than it was in prehistoric times. So Benatar does recognize this. He acknowledges Pinker's point, but he thinks that what's really important is not the rate of violence, the amount of violence per person, but the total amount of violence, right? How many killings there are in the world each year is what's important to him. And he is right here that even though the rate of violence is declining, each human being now is, I think, something like 100 times less likely to kill someone than they were in prehistoric times. There's a lot more of us. There's 8 billion of us rather than a few thousand. But we have a lot of power over other animals too, so we can kill many more of them, right? So the issue for Benatar is that the total amount of violence and harm is still very, very high. Nonetheless, I think if the diminishing rates of violence that Pinker argues for continue, it might well be the case that the rates of violence are so negligible that the total amount of violence also comes down to near zero. It also bears on each individual's choice whether or not to procreate, what the rates of violence are like. So if it is the case that for each individual human being, they're highly unlikely to commit any particularly severe harms or destruction, then Benatar's case that each of us has a presumptive duty not to create humans because they will be harmful seems much less strong. Okay, the second point to note here is that there really does seem to be an increasing concern for non-humans and for the environment generally. And this maybe was not as obvious when Benatar wrote his book and wrote this paper, I should say, in 2013 or so. So it does seem to be the case that, for example, rates of veganism have gone up by quite a lot in that decade. So they've gone from something like 1% when Benatar was writing this paper to something like 6% in the UK. I don't know what the figures are elsewhere. But this is one sign that people are starting to become more concerned for the well-being and starting to become less harmful towards non-human animals. Similar things could be said for the environment. We have many more environmental advocacy groups, political parties, etc., than there were maybe 10 or 20 years ago. It seems that people are much more concerned about and aware of environmental harms than they used to be. There is also, which again was probably not quite the case when Benatar was writing this, there is the imminent prospect of synthetic meat, synthetic animal products that could allow us to continue to eat the kinds of food we want to without having to harm or kill any animals. Okay, and finally, as some people in the Uehiro Center have argued, there is the possibility of morally enhancing ourselves. So even if Benatar is completely correct and we're rotten, nasty to the core, it's possible that we can recognize how nasty we are and use technology to fix that. So there are various genetic interventions that have been proposed. There are even different drugs, different chemicals that, for example, increase people's empathy, decrease violent tendencies, and so on. So again, this is another possibility for reducing the harmfulness of human beings. Am I okay for time, Liz? Yeah. Okay.
You've got about 5 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Okay, then I'll just look at one or two more things. Okay, so the second point I want to make also is relating to animals and animal suffering. So let's say we accept what Benatar says, humanity is just the most destructive and harmful species there is. This gives us a kind of prima facie reason not to create more people. However, whether or not we should create more people depends on what the alternatives are. So we might think, for example, that if human beings just voluntarily let themselves go extinct, if we all stop procreating tomorrow, that nature would kind of return to some idyllic state, the environment would bounce back into full health, animals would not be harmed by us anymore, and instead would live happy, natural lives in the wild. I think this is highly unlikely to be the case. It seems to be the case that many or most animals living in the wild, and if you've seen my talk last year or the year before, you might know I have some thoughts on this. It seems to be the case that most animal lives are not good ones. Most animal lives are very, very short. You imagine a small animal like a fish or a small reptile or something. The typical life seems to be get born, roam around for a few minutes trying to find something to eat and get eaten by something else, or roam around a bit longer and starve to death. So we're not going to get into the arguments for why we might think that there is more suffering than well-being in nature, but let's assume for the moment that is true. If it is the case that there is much more suffering than well-being among wild animals, then we're in a sort of odd situation that human beings are this extremely harmful species, but there's a background here, an axiological background of net negative value. All these bad lives being lived by non-human animals purely due to natural processes which have nothing to do with human agency, right? So if human beings just go extinct, the alternative picture is not the sort of kumbaya, idyllic state for animals. What happens is the continuation of the status quo in which wild animals live pretty bad lives. And the alternative involves this happening for millions of years. So if we think human beings do have the capacity to improve morally and are improving morally, and if we also think that human beings may one day have the capacity to reduce or even eliminate wild animal suffering, we're in an odd situation where humans are the ones doing huge amounts of harm, but we're also the only species that can possibly reduce the natural harms that are happening, whether we're here or not. So we might think that creating more human beings is, while harmful in the short term, if humans continue to be destructive towards other animals, towards the environment, towards each other, it might be necessary for having a better future over the very long term. Okay, and just very briefly then, I think there is a disanalogy between creating morally responsible beings like humans. So if I create a human being, it doesn't seem reasonable to think that I should be responsible for everything the human being does during his or her life. So if I have a child, that child will grow up to become a morally responsible, moral agent who is capable of taking responsibility for their own actions, right? So I create a child, I might be responsible for some of the things they do. It doesn't seem that I can be responsible for everything they do. In the case of animals, I think things are a bit different. If I create a harmful animal or I release a harmful animal, it's something slightly akin to releasing a harmful machine, right? The animal is not a moral agent. It cannot take moral responsibility for what it does. So if anyone takes moral responsibility for the harmful acts of an animal, it has to be me. So it might be the case then that while we do have a general presumptive duty not to cause harmful animals to exist, because we would be responsible for the harms that the animals do, this might not apply, or it might not apply as straightforwardly in the case of human beings, because we as procreators do not take any, or we do not take full responsibility for the actions of our grown-up children. And finally, we might ask whether the good things humans do can outweigh all of these terrible things we do. I'm not going to talk about this one too much. It's a possibility if we really think that humans create objectively valuable things like progress in science or great works of artistic merit or something like that. We might think that there is some possibility that all these good things can be put on the scale against all the harms that we commit against animals and the environment. Okay, so bottom line then, we might agree with Benatar that humanity is, at the moment, a moral disaster, the most harmful species on the planet by far, but we could think that procreation is justified for one of several reasons. We might think humanity is the only being capable of creating certain goods, science, art, philosophy, or whatever. We might think that humans are the only species capable of eliminating natural evil and natural suffering from the biosphere. We might also think, finally, that procreators are just not morally responsible for the harms caused by their children in ways they would be for the harms caused by animals they create. Okay, so we won't have time to look at the second argument, but I think there's plenty to talk about there. Okay, thank you for listening.